All right, this is my Mimi, Janie Thompson, Boyer Thompson. Mimi, could you go ahead and tell me about geographic information about your family? Like, where did they call home? I know that they lived in Oklahoma for a long time. How did they get from Oklahoma to anywhere else? Stuff like that.
So on my father's side, which the unique thing about my family is that both of my parents had the same last name. And it was actually why they met each other, but there was no relationship there. So my father, the Boyers, and the Martins. So my grandmother was a Martin and my grandfather was a Boyer. They actually came to Oklahoma as small children in covered wagons and settled in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, prior to statehood. My grandmother's family came from Missouri via Mississippi. My grandfather's family came from Indiana. And they settled in the area of Carnegie, and so their families were settling families in Carnegie, Oklahoma. My mother's family is more from southeastern Oklahoma, Tishomingo, Rabia, Mansville area, Russet area. And so I know that my grandfather's dad was a sharecropper for my grandmother's father. So she married the sharecropper's son. My grandmother's heritage came from Texas, had Cherokee Indian in her background. My great-grandmother was actually on the Cherokee Rolls in Texas, but when they moved into Oklahoma and settled land and were landowners, my great-grandfather would not allow her to sign on the rolls any longer, and he didn't sign on the rolls. And that was why he was a great landowner as a partial Native American. He was a quarter Indian, and had sharecroppers. My understanding is that he actually also had some slaves prior to the end of the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. But many of them continued to reside and be sharecroppers on his land. So my mother was born and raised in a little area called Mansville and Russet, Oklahoma, which is just outside of Tishomingo, where my dad was raised totally in the area of Carnegie, Oklahoma. My dad was sheriff of Caddo County and lived in Anadarko for up until he and my mother met and married, and Dad took a job with the state in Oklahoma City, and so they moved to Oklahoma City about 1954, 1955. But my grandparents and the majority of my father's family stayed in western Oklahoma, and my mother's family is still to this day, for the most part, in various parts of southern Oklahoma, but some are here in Oklahoma City, and I have a group of cousins that are also in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of switching gears, obviously the Native part, you can't say this because you've always been here, but do you know about how many generations have resided in the U.S.?
Well, if I went back, I do have an ancestry book, and I need to be better versed in that. Mm-hmm. I know that I had ancestors that were in the Revolutionary War, but I also know that I had ancestors on both sides of the Civil War as well. So I know that that's how far back we go.
Yeah. So all of them, no one that you knew really was.
I think probably at least 3 generations.
At least 3. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So another kind of switching gear question. We kind of wanted to talk about adoption. I know that you weren't adopted, but you were kind of conceived later on in your parents' life. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that? Because the question kind of says, why did your parents choose to have you? Or what are some of the ways you feel connected to your family that are really meaningful to you?
So my father had been married before. He was 7 years older than my mother, and had 3 children from his first marriage. They were all just about grown by the time my mom and dad married. The closest in age to me is 16 years older than I am. So my mother had never been married. It was after World War II. Mother was actively working during World War II in the defense plants. So she was working in defense plants in Kansas, also went to California, came back, worked at what is now Tinker Field, but was Lockheed at that point in time, and of course was working on putting together aircraft for the war efforts. So she was pretty busy, and it was not a time that was really lended itself to finding a husband. So it was not until after that time, and she had returned back to Tishomingo in the court clerk's office, that she met my father. So she had never been married, didn't think she would ever have any children. She was 35 when they married and 37 when I was born. My dad was 44. So I was raised more like an only child because my older siblings, 2 of them were married and already had children by the time I came along. So it was kind of a different feeling. And I think many times we sometimes are closer to one side than the other. I think probably I consider myself closer to my mother's side of the family, but part of that is it was a very large family, and it was easy to be absorbed into that larger population. And I was very close to my grandparents on my dad's side, but not as much my siblings, because they were already grown and had their own lives, and they were more like...
I mean, there's no FaceTime that you can call and ask them and talk to them.
Yeah, they felt more like aunts or something, than they did siblings.
Yeah, and that's 16 years difference. Like,
yes.
Old enough to drive a car when you're born, which is kind of crazy. So, also, you know that I'm adopted. You know that my dad was adopted by your husband. I know the answer to this question, but for the interview, could you kind of talk about that special kind of connection that our family isn't just about who's biologically related to us?
Yes. I will say that for my children, I have 2 stepdaughters, and I have my son and my daughter. As far as I'm concerned, they're all my kids. My stepdaughters were 4 and 6 when we got married, 4 and 2 when we first started dating and met each other. And my son was 4 at the same time when we got married. And my husband adopted my son, and to this day, the girls will tell you that if they were going to say their dad had a favorite child, it would be their brother. There was a bond there, and he described it, I think, in a way that probably is the very best way. And he chose to love me. The rest of you didn't have a choice. But he chose to love me. But he also chose to love him as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it creates a very different bond, because it is one of choice. It wasn't one where this is the son he was given, this is the son he chose to take.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with me and you. I can remember when my first biological grandchild was on the way, I had people actually ask me, was I going to feel any different? And I went, absolutely not. This was this is the one that made me a grandmother. This is the one that made me Mimi. I see absolutely no difference. I feel nothing different for Taylor than I do Michaela. And probably in many ways, because of the uniqueness of our situation. Michaela was sick when she was little, and that bonding was it was such a much stronger bond because of that, because of the special time that I spent with her, and worried over her and prayed over her and loved over her, that there's probably not a bond that's anywhere close to that bond for that reason.
And then we also have added Katie and Darian. And even like Armida and Dre, who aren't technically even your grandkids.
Right.
We have really special relationships.
I love and I mean, and I think that that's just part of your heart. I grew up an only child in many ways at home, even though I had siblings, they weren't in my house. And I longed for a brother or sister. And I always told my mother that I was going to have many, many kids. And I wanted to have a big family like she did. But unfortunately, I was born with a congenital urinary and kidney issue that really kind of, the doctors indicated I wasn't supposed to have any children at all. And my dream was to always have at least 4. You know, and every little kid plays house. They say, well, I'm this old. And so my dream age was 25. That was ideal. And then I was going to have 4 kids. And so I was pushed the elements in order to have 2 of my own. But because God blessed my wish, I still had my 4, just in a different way. And so the same thing he's done is to multiply my blessings of kids through my grandchildren, and in many ways, whether it be by blood, adoption, he just continues to bless me. And that's how I see each and every one of them, as an individual blessing, but they're all mine, and they're all mine equally. And like you mentioned, you know, I also see my son-in-laws and daughter-in-laws as my children. They are mine. God blessed me with them as well. And so because of that, their families are also very much part of my family. Those families were blended. It wasn't a lighting of those separate unity candles just for a scene or a ceremony, or blending of sands together for a ceremony. It truly was what it was meant to be, and the families have been blended together. And you know, my grandchildren from my daughters, and call the other grandparents by their grandparent names, even though they may not be their grandparents. That's what they call them, because we're all family.
Yeah, I totally agree. So can you talk a little bit, like I know all of ours that we do now, can you talk a little bit about traditions, religious celebrations, rites of passage that you had with the older generations of your family growing up?
You know, growing up, most of my holidays, I do remember having a couple of holidays I was blessed to spend with the youngest of my half-siblings at her home, and she had 1 son. But most of our holidays were spent either at home, or as long as my grandfather on my mother's side was alive, we would have Christmas morning that morning, and then load up and we would head to Rabia, Oklahoma to be with my grandfather, because my grandmother died when I was just a year old, so he was by himself. And so the family still tried to get together Easter and Christmas, coming in from various parts of the state to all be there together at his little small humble abode together. And it was a joyous time. It wasn't about opening packages. My grandfather didn't have the money to buy packages for all of his grandkids, or the ability. He was on 2 canes and did well to walk, and he certainly didn't have a car. It was about family. It was about being together and everybody bringing dishes, and we all got together and ate, took pictures together, and had a good time. I can remember some of my favorite Easters were being there early, and I had cousins that lived in Rabia, and going to the little small country church on Easter Sunday morning, and all of those old hymns being sung in that little country church, and that memory is still very vital to me. Lily of the Valley, some of those traditional Easter songs were very important to me. And as I got older and I lost my grandfather when I was 9, the traditions kind of changed, but most of them revolved again around my mother's oldest sister lived here. There were 12 children. My mother was 3rd from the bottom, so her oldest sister was more like a grandmother to me. And then that particular aunt's children were the same age as my mom. So they were her nieces, but they were about her age, not much younger than her. And so we gathered together with them for various holidays. Even that continued even into my married years and having children, taking the kids with us, and we went and blended. The cousin that I am the closest to is also an only child, And so she and I are the closest even today. But I think the biggest thing about the traditions is it always centered around family. Always.
So, like, being together was more important than anything else.
Yes.
Yeah. So switching gears again, can you talk a little bit of like kind of the values and attitudes of your family members? Like, is there anything that you kind of all really believed? Like, I know you talked about it being like religious, that you guys would do Christmas and Easter together. Obviously, those are Christian holidays. Is there any like social things that you guys were really passionate about together, things like that?
Well, after my grandfather passed away, one of his requests was the family not lose track of each other and not lose that bond. So he requested that we have a family reunion every year. And we did, and we always have. Unfortunately, so I will be 65 this year. My grandfather passed away when I was 8. And we've had family reunions every year until COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And even though all the siblings are now gone, and now my cousins are beginning to pass away, I'm the baby of all the grandkids. We are still trying to get together. With COVID, we haven't for the last 2 years. But when something happens in the family, we still find a way of getting together.
Mm-hmm.
We had lost 2 cousins in the midst of COVID this time, but we still found a way to get together and to take care of each other's hearts. And so now, well, reunions used to revolve around going to Platte National Park in Sulphur with big picnics, then moved to be closer to the oldest surviving of the siblings was in Ada. Then it moved to the city because at that point my mom was the oldest surviving. And then in the latter years we've moved to a cousin that lives in Ninnekah and has a little bit of land. But now I think we've decided that we're just going to make it simple, where nobody's cooking, nobody's feeling responsible for things, but we just get together. And so now it's falling to me to organize a restaurant where we can meet and all get together and have a meal and just be able to catch up with each other and keep in touch. And I think those are the biggest social things that
Mm-hmm.
we do. Again, it all has to do with family and being together.
Yeah, so there's not like you have to have a purple scarf or you have to have a turkey. It's just about being together. That's really nice. Is it like easier with things like Facebook and things like that to keep in touch, or some members use it, some members don't?
With Facebook, it's easier for most of us, but some of us are not socially connected or technologically connected. Again, like I said, I'm the youngest of grandchildren, so most of them are in their 70s and 80s. So it is a little bit more of a challenge, but at least most of them all do have cell phones, and that works really well.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
good. Awesome. So growing up, did you have interactions with persons or people from diverse backgrounds, like people of different colors or different like gay people or anything like that when you were growing up?
So remembering that I was born in 1956,
Yes.
and it was probably 1959, 1960 that we lived in northeast Oklahoma City when I was born and growing up. And at that point is when integration began to happen in that part of Oklahoma City. And so I have faint memories of some of those things. And you know, my mother was never prejudiced, but she also recognized that society was. And so that concern of making sure that I wasn't in a position that would make me criticized by society seemed to be more her concern.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that she talked often of the nanny that helped to raise my grandmother, remembering that she was of a family with money,
Mm-hmm.
and was black, and that she came and helped my grandmother. I mean, she loved my grandmother. So when my grandmother started having children, And again, they were sharecroppers, and so she would come, watch, and stay with the little kids while my grandmother went out to the field with my grandfather. And so, as a matter of fact, my mother's oldest sister, the aunt I referred to, they had not named her. She was still, her birth certificate said baby girl Boyer. And so they had nicknamed her Jack for whatever reason. And that was what she went by, and she knew she didn't have a name.
How can you not have a name? Is that a thing that people
They
did?
never really named her. They never could agree on a name, I guess. And so when one day my grandmother came in from the field and she said, I know what my name's going to be. My name's Ada. My grandmother said, okay, your name's Ada. And that was because that was the name, she took the name of her nanny. And that was her name. So she was named after a black woman. So clearly there was not, and of course there was Native American in the family. And so it wasn't a feeling of prejudice at all. My mother even refers to stories that my grandmother told, that they would be asleep in the night and some of the Native Americans would ride up on horseback. And what my grandmother relayed is they would start chanting hickey hi, hickey ho, and it was they were needing food. And so they would go out and take food to them, and then they would ride back off to the reservations, I'm assuming. So this was back, obviously, in the 1800s, when my grandmother was a little girl. So there's always been kind of a meshing, per se.
Yeah.
But I do, and I can kind of remember it. You know, I have a little vague pieces of memory. But my mother kind of relates the story, but parts of it is because I can see the room, I can see where I was laying to take a nap. Our little neighbors had a little boy, and he often would come over once in a while to play, but not for a long period of time. And again, I think it was because he was a boy, I was a girl. That was, that was the issue. But he would come over and play, and I had a playhouse in the backyard that my father had built for me. And how neighborhoods transitioned was people would move in the night.
Why are they moving in the night?
The next day you would wake up and it appeared the house might be empty. And then a couple of days later, somebody had moved in, and it was a black family. And so that was how integration began, is that it was like the neighbors didn't want their neighbors to know they sold their house to a black family, so they would move quickly.
Would they be mad? Would people be upset about that?
Today, I don't think they would be, but back then, I think they were concerned, I guess, about property values, and I don't know. It was the time.
Yeah.
It was the time.
Okay,
so
I gotcha.
The neighbors that moved in next door had a little girl, and I remember being, we were playing, which is what we used to do with the little boy, because we're both out in the backyard playing while our mothers were doing something. It's a fenced yard, so that they felt we were safe. Doors were open with just the screen door closed. They could hear us playing, and so we'd be out at the fence line, because it was a fence you could see through. It was a chain link fence, and so I was doing the same thing with this same little girl now, and we were bringing our toys out and talking to each other and playing. And
I mean, you were an only child, so that's who else are you gonna play with?
Right, and so then I asked my mom, I wanted her to come over. Can she come over and play in my playhouse? And so my mom said, well, maybe she can do that, another day. And I remember it was nap time. I'd come in for nap time, and she was going to try to have a conversation about society and, that people kind of tend to socialize and operate in their own world, so to speak. And I could see as a 3-year-old where this conversation was going. And I said, well, Mommy, God loves them too, just like he loves us. And she said, she looked at me and she said, absolutely he does, and you are absolutely correct. And she walked out of the room.
Okay.
And she told my father, we probably are going to need to move.
Oh my goodness.
Because she's right. Everything, and I agree with her, but I don't want her to be
In trouble, basically.
ostracized by society. And so it wasn't that my mother was prejudiced, but that she was concerned for what others would think of me. Or I think more the concern at that point is I grow up continuing to see no difference.
And then she felt like things would go badly.
Intermarriage at that point in time would be highly looked down upon. And that's exactly where that was going. And so I think that was the concern. Because my mother's best friend, later on in life, was black. So I know that there wasn't a prejudice there. It simply had to do with
like social concern.
The social concerns.
Awesome. Well, that makes sense. And nobody's saying like, oh, your mom was a bad person. It's just how things kind of were. And obviously things are really different now. Like we have all different colors in our family. So you would say like, obviously, because I know the answer to this question, you feel like you have a level of comfort with anybody of any color at any time.
Yes.
Yeah. Just because of how like our family has progressed and things like that.
Well, it's not just that. It's,
Stop it.
Even in college, in my undergrad, my honors was in African American history. Because I had it, to me, that was an important aspect I wanted to know more about. With my dad being founders in Carnegie, Anadarko, my grandparents grew up in a very highly Native American populated. My oldest half-sister that we referred to, her husband is full Native American. So there was already that intermarriage, obviously, of Native American population. Kind of the interesting thing that has emerged in the last recent years is I always grew up with knowing that, like, you know, when you list all the things you are, Cherokee, French, obviously being Boyer on both sides, there's French, there was German, and there's a thing called Black Dutch. And I always thought, well, what is Black Dutch? And nobody really had a real answer except, well, that's what your grandfather on your dad's side has a lot of Black Dutch in it. That's why, you know, you got the dark eyes and the kind of tend to have dark circles under your eyes and so forth. And now that we have Ancestry.com, and I've kind of gone through some genetic testing for other reasons medically, I've discovered that I have a small portion of Ashkenazi Jew. Well, Black Dutch is actually, hang on, it's Robbie.
So Black Dutch.
So the thing about Black Dutch is not a real
racial identity,
race or ethnic group, etc. It was used because of that very thing of prejudice and trying to hide one's ethnicity. So, you know, as the Jews in Europe are, you know, they settled in Europe when in various stages of all the way from the time it was the Holy Roman Empire, and depending on the political changes that took place, the Jews found themselves fleeing constantly. And so when they would settle in certain places, that Black Dutch, especially when they ended up in Dutch Netherlands area, it was a way of hiding what their true ethnicity was. Most often Jewish. It has been used for others as well, to hide persecution, discrimination. So while I have never personally felt discriminated, clearly at some point I've had ancestors that were, whether it be some of my Native American ancestors, for reason why they absolutely would not sign on the Dawes rolls
Mm-hmm.
because they were a mix, and so therefore they could kind of pass as not being Native American, or it be because of their Jewish background. Obviously, I've had ancestors that were fleeing some type of discrimination or persecution. And so I haven't experienced that, but only by God's blessings.
Right.
I had the brown eyes, the dark hair. I could have been born in a different time in a different place and found myself in a discriminating situation.
Right. I mean, you're a history major. You went through that. You decided to do more research into that because it was important to you to understand that, right?
Yes.
Awesome. So, can you talk a little bit about gender roles and expectations kind of you experienced growing up? Like, you talked a little bit because there was a little boy next to you and, like, you felt like what? Expound on that.
So I feel like I sometimes think that maybe us playing together on a continual basis was not much different than playing with a little black girl.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was little boys play one way and little girls play a different way. And I don't know that that was necessarily from my parents' side as much as maybe afraid the little boy was going to play house and play dolls. And
So his family was upset that he might have played house with you or a girly game?
I think that and of course remember that it was a different day and time where you
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm
tended
just,
to
yeah.
play at home and you didn't go over to other people's houses that
Mm-hmm.
much. But I know that later.
Okay, we're talking about the boy.
So, having only been 3, I can't remember. I don't remember details. I just know that most of our playtime was between the fence,
Uh-huh.
but it wasn't opposed to me. I don't remember ever going to his house. If I did, it was one time. But I think that probably is more about the fact that I was an unhealthy child
Yeah.
and an older parent, and her being overly protective
Yeah.
was more about that than it was the male-female thing.
Yeah.
I think things that are noticeable during that period of time, especially during World War II, but even Oklahoma still had a diploma nurse program with St. Anthony and OCU even to the late 70s, because that was what I originally was going to go to, was that particular program.
What's a diploma nurse for me?
So a diploma nurse, keep in mind that women really were not openly accepted into the higher ed system
Uh-huh.
for engineering or any of those college degree areas. They had to fight their way through.
And was that like explicit when you were going to college? Like they said women no need to apply, or?
No, not by the time I went into college, but would be true for my parents. As my aunts and uncles, no one had a college degree. My mother, when she came back from after the war, went to business college. In other words,
Secretary?
college to learn to be a secretary.
Yeah.
But not for a degree. It was like
A certificate?
A certificate. And you say that, teaching certificate,
It's not the same as what it used to be.
that's why we still call it a teaching certificate. Teachers, women were either going to go be a teacher or a nurse. And so you've got a diploma,
Uh-huh.
and that's therefore the title diploma nurse. My mother-in-law was a diploma nurse. Or you got a teaching certificate,
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't get a degree
Mm-hmm.
in either way. But it didn't mean that you didn't go to school for the same length of time and have the same coursework.
Mm-hmm.
A diploma nurse actually went to school, instead of going for 4 years with breaks in between,
Yeah.
they went for 3 solid years, 12 months out of the year. In most cases, they were housed on a campus of a hospital, or the hospital was located very close proximity to, if not on the same campus, as the training institution.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were taking their college courses at the college, and they really are often referred to as indentured servants, because if they weren't in class, they were working at the hospital.
And they were doing like CNA type stuff?
Yes, and then as their skills grew, they added those skills to what they were doing in
That's
at
brutal.
the hospital. And so while my father-in-law they were not married, they were single. As a matter of fact, my mother-in-law graduated high school from Wetumpka, Oklahoma at the age of 17. And none of the nursing schools in Oklahoma would take her because she wasn't 18.
Mm-hmm.
So she actually had to go to Dallas, Texas area in order to go to be accepted at age 17. So while he was at World War II on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, she went through nursing school for those 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until the end of the war that he was able to come home, which also pretty much coincided with her completion of school, that she came back to Oklahoma and they married. But it was a diploma nurse, and later on diploma nurses had to be grandfathered in and accepted as the same as a BSN nurse.
Why would it be different why would it be different than a BSN?
It really wasn't.
And so could a man go get a BSN?
There wasn't a BSN. So a BSN is a bachelor's degree. So it really wasn't any different. That's why they grandfathered them in. So, for instance, for Putnam City Schools, for school nursing, you have to have your bachelor's degree. Primarily because you have to be on the same level as a teacher. So you have to have the same degree level. But diploma nurses are grandfathered in, as a BSN nurse.
Yeah.
Because their education is the same level. They didn't have the opportunity.
So if you were a gal in that time, you're like, oh, I'm going to go to college, but you can't say you're going to college, and you don't have a bachelor's. So could a man go to school and get a bachelor's of science in nursing? Or was that even, like, why would I, as a man, go get a
You
BSN?
didn't really see them do that.
Yeah, okay.
You didn't see, I don't ever, and I spent a lot of time in hospitals growing up. Never saw a male nurse, ever.
I mean, even in my time, I know like 5. I know Poppy, we have 1 that's a dialysis nurse, and 2 that I've seen like in unit.
We have a lot more now, a lot more in our nursing schools now.
Yes.
Than we did. But in 1960s and 70s, even then you didn't see male nurses. Just as you didn't see elementary male teachers, you might see some high school level teachers, but you wouldn't see elementary male teachers. They would be principals, but they wouldn't be the teachers.
So was that the sentiment of your parents? Like, why would a woman go to college? Or why would I
No.
need to go to college?
They always wanted better for me. And I think, my mother didn't have that opportunity. My dad didn't have the opportunity to go to college. However, his sister did. She had a teaching, probably a teaching certificate at some point, but she was in home economics is what they called it back then. So she was geared in a certain direction.
So she could teach kids how to like sew and cook at school and stuff.
Cook and be a mom, be a housewife, etc., etc. Today we've even changed that because it's not home economics; it's family and consumer science is what it is now, and it goes way beyond that. And you see a mixture of males and females in those courses. Even when I was in high school in the 70s, I was in home ec, and there were no males in my home economics classes.
Could you take shop if you wanted to?
I don't think I would have been denied shop, but I don't think it was
It would have been weird.
It would have been really weird. Yes, it would have been very weird. But you would have been seen as being a tomboy or something was not quite right with you.
Yeah.
Why you were wanting
So
to.
tomboy is definitely negative if you went to school in the 70s.
Yes.
Whereas like if you're a tomboy in 2020 or when I graduated in 2017,
Yes.
no one even cares or bats an eye.
Yes. Yes.
In fact, I think I had to take 1 shop and 1 home ec to graduate, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe I just needed a spot filled, so I don't know. Okay, good to know.
So And as far as the cousins are concerned, several of us went to college, but I will say that most of us that went to college are actually teachers within education. So, women were beauticians, which one of my cousins is a beautician, teachers or nurses. I didn't have any nurses in my family. My mother-in-law was my first nurse in my family. And of course of the siblings in my family, none of them went to college, my half siblings. So I would be considered first generation college student.
And so when you were raising your kids, I know the answer to this one, but for the people at home, there was a huge emphasis on education for the boys and the girls.
There was never an option. My daughter will tell you, the youngest one, Robbie will tell you, I didn't know there was an option to not go to college. It was just an understood. The difference is I didn't go. Well, I had a scholarship to go. I didn't go, and that's why I'm not a nurse. That's why I'm an educator right out of high school. When I went to my 10-year class reunion, and I hadn't lived up to what I should have lived up to, I and the next time I go to a class reunion, I will have my degree. And I enrolled in 17 hours that fall.
Dang.
And at that time, I had a 4-year-old and a 10-year-old. And I started at junior college, and I graduated Phi Theta Kappa, and also was an honors grad at what then was El Reno Junior College, and valedictorian of the class. Had transfer scholarships as well as a cash scholarship to go to OU, and graduated with a BA in history, second major in education, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and was named the outstanding U.S. history student on campus. So not only did I decide I was going to college and completed that double major in 4 years, I did it first of all for myself, but I also did it for my parents. Because I felt like they had counted on me doing it, and I didn't do it. And I wanted to make sure that I did it, and I made them proud when I did it.
Were they around to see you graduate?
They were. You know, probably the greatest memory I have of my graduation was we were still a small enough group that we actually had graduation in Lloyd Noble. And I remember that we were kind of in between college presidents. President Horton was the president at the time. And so he made a very big point of recognizing those people that were behind the scenes that supported those college students in their efforts. And I can remember knowing exactly where my family was sitting. My husband, my 2 children, my mother, my dad and my stepmom were in a different location, but I knew where they were. And he asked for those that were parents of children graduating. While I might not have been a traditional student, you could see the pride on my mother's face when she was able to stand. But what really stands out in my mind is President Horton talked about there were others that had made sacrifices for their parents to be able to go to school. And he asked for them to stand and to watch them just jump up and to see the pride on their faces. That will always be the greatest thing that I have. But I took them to class. They used to go to class with me. If it was a day that I had just one class, I'd take Robbie, and I can remember one of the times she went with me. It was my English history class. Dr. Judy Lewis. And she was coloring. She'd take her crayons and she'd color, but she heard the lectures. And several years later, when she's at OU, she enrolled in a women's history class. And lo and behold, it was Judy Lewis that was going to be her professor. And I said, Robbie, you tell Dr. Lewis this isn't the first time you've been in one of her classes.
That's funny.
that you actually brought your crayons and your coloring book to class the first time that you've been in class with her. And so it's building that with your kids. Don't be afraid if you are a continuing student, if you're working on your grad school. It's important to have those kids on a college campus so that they see it.
Mm-hmm.
They watch you study. They know how important it is. And so today, I still have one that is working on her master's now, finally gone back to school again for the second time. I have one that now has his 2 masters, and he's working on his PhD. So education has always been emphasized, and that you're never too old to learn, and it's something that you should continue to do for as long as you're breathing, whether it's in a formal setting, working towards a degree, or if it's educating yourself continually and being continually willing to change and grow.
That is very poignant.
That same example has been set, and I'm grateful for that for my grandchildren.
Well, you make us look like we're a bunch of bums, so I don't think I could have kids and go to school. So that is a big sacrifice, and I know that, you know, we watched Mom go through doctor school, and I know that was really hard on her, but I also understand, like, kind of the work that goes into making your dreams come true. So definitely something to be proud of. Okay, is there anything else that, like, we didn't cover today but you'd like to be known?
I think the biggest, I think we covered an awful lot. I think values that are established by parents and grandparents are what transcend through their generations. And I think that's what's important. And those values are faith, love, family, loyalty, integrity. Those are the hallmarks, I think, that both my husband and I tried to entrench in our children, and I see our children entrenching those same values in our grandchildren. And while he's not here and has not been here to see any of our grandchildren or to see our children be parents, I know that he would be proud and recognize that we set those values and they had been lasting values.
Wow, that's really nice. Okay, thanks for interviewing with me, Mimi. Mwah.
You're welcome.